Welcome, everyone. I take it this mic is working. I seem to be able to hear my voice all around. I hope you can hear me. Welcome, everyone, to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, both the people in the room here and people online. We're very happy to have you here for another talk in the RSE Investigates series. I am Jennifer Smith, and I'm Professor of Sociolinguistics at the University of Glasgow, and I'll be introducing the speaker tonight. Before I do that, I have a quite scary list of things I have to go through here. Talia has given me a list of things, housekeeping things I have to go through. So forgive me if I talk in a monotone through these. I want to make sure I get all of them. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please note that the RSE fire safety and evacuation procedure is to assemble outside the dome, leaving the building the way you came in. RSE staff will be here to help you with instructions in the case of evacuation. We're not expecting an alarm, but RSE staff will be on hand to help and guide you if a fire alarm does go off. And I hear that the RSE staff will wave at the back of the room. And I see Talia waving there. I should say as well that there are a couple of rooms that you can use during this event, should you need to leave this room. And that is the Scott room, which is a prayer room, and the James Clerk Maxwell room, which is a quiet room, if you've had enough of myself and Jeremy's voices. And there'll be, the day will go like this. I will introduce the speaker, and then we'll have the talk, and then we'll have about half an hour for a Q&A at the end. And what we'll do with the Q&A is we generally limit it to one question per speaker, just so that as many people as possible get a chance to ask that burning question that they have. And I think, Talia, I've covered everything there, have I? Yes, I got 2 thumbs up, so that's a good sign. So, I'm really over the moon. I'm extremely pleased to introduce our speaker for the evening, Jeremy Smith, who, until his retirement in 2021, was Professor of English Philology at the University of Glasgow. And crucially, Jeremy was my boss. So I have to behave myself tonight. Jeremy's specialism is in English historical linguistics, the history of Scots, book history, and early English and Scots language and literature. He's a prolific writer. I realised when I said that, it makes you sound like Barbara Cartland. He's a prolific writer with a vast and very distinguished back catalogue of research in these areas. Some of his more recent books include Transforming Early English, Genre in English Medical Writing, and Reinventing Medieval Liturgy in Victorian England. His latest book is Lexicons of English Religion, 1380 to 1850, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and I believe that's to come out in August. Great. So that gives you a CV-type rundown of Jeremy's quite impressive accomplishments. But for me and for many others, Jeremy is the absolute definition of an intellectual who's interested in and curious about and knows so much about so many things. And he's able to transmit that knowledge in a highly accessible and entertaining way, as you'll see tonight. You're in for a treat tonight. And finally, amongst all this intellectual stuff, it's important to point out that Jeremy is a thoroughly good egg. He is a good human being. He was an amazing colleague at Glasgow, so generous with his time with both staff and students. And he was so patient in the face of having to continually herd academics. Not an easy thing. Really, his contribution to the discipline is really immense, both in his own research and beyond that as well. And this generosity now continues with the work that he does with the RSE, and particularly his outreach work. He's been known to get on a 9-hour train ride right up to Wick, simply to talk to some school children about the history of Scots. Now that is dedication. So, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the stage, Jeremy, and he's going to tell us about the history of English and Scots in 10-ish objects. Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That's quite overwhelming, and I'm very grateful for that lovely comment. I was very lucky with my colleagues, and Jennifer was one of my, well, it sounds very patronising this, but she's one of my stars. So it's lovely to have that comment from you. I'm going to talk about the history of English and Scots in approximately 10 objects. And that's because some of the objects move around a bit, and some of them also, we're not quite sure whether they're English or Scots. And someone said to me once, well, let's have a clear definition of English and Scots and how they work together. And that's actually not possible because they're they have a complicated relationship. And that always sounds rather depressing for some people. In the old days, I used to get these phone calls from journalists who would ring up and say, give us the straight answer on this. And I say, the technique is to say, that's a very complicated question which deserves a complicated answer. And you could hear the depression in their voice coming over when they realized they had a deadline to finish to file 500 words at 3 o'clock. So there you go. That's a technique which many academics develop. I'm going to talk today about something which has a rather grandiose notion underpinning it, but then I'm going to look at some various pictures and talk about them a little bit in a quite informal way, because that in many ways raises some interesting questions. Jennifer has said that, has flagged that I like going off talking to school children. And that's because I've reached antiquity, you see, and they ask you these great questions like, how old are you really? Which is what I got last time I did one, which was great, there we go. And one of the things about being old is you kind of wonder what it was you were attempting to achieve during the course of your career, and you look back on it a bit, don't you? You think, now, at the time you didn't know what you were doing really, but looking back on it, you say, now, what was it I was doing? I suppose it was sort of cracking codes, really, and looking at material from the past and trying to find out what it was trying to signal. Because material in the past often hides from us. It tells us things which we're not quite sure about. I'm going to be touching upon a phenomenon which is sometimes referred to rather trendily, well, it was trendy back about 10 years ago, called the material turn. And the material turn is a powerful trend in both humanities and social sciences. It emphasizes the importance of artifacts and natural forces and material regimes to social practices and systems of power. And materiality, it's been said, is an essential semiotic dimension of all texts. What a text looks like, its material, tells us something about how it functions. Its form can be, if we start to interrogate it, tells us something about its functions. It plays an essential role for the reader's reception of the text. And that's a kind of rather fancy way of saying that when we look at an object, it often tells us things if we look at it in another way. Archaeologists do this sort of thing, and so do people like me, philologists, people who work with texts. What that text looks like and how it appears and its situation, it demands interpretation. It almost means that we have to sit there worrying about how code works. Sometimes codes like that can be kind of tricky, and we have to use a certain amount of imagination when we encounter it. Some objects, of course, are so old that it's sometimes really very hard indeed to work out what it was. And when I do this sort of talk, I love to start with this. There it is. I don't know if anyone's seen this. This is the Lion Man of the Stadel Cave. It's 40,000 years old, approximately. And it was found just before World War II in a cave in Germany. And it's supposed to be a religious object. And you sort of think it must be because it's got a lion's head on a human body. And I'm sorry to say that even 40,000 years ago, there weren't many lions' heads on human bodies. I think we can guess that this is a made-up mythical creature. And it was found at the end of the cave, and then people wondered about it and what it was doing there, because there are other caves as well, caves facing south. And if you live in a cave, it's good to have a cave facing south in the northern hemisphere, because it's cozier, it's warmer, you see, sun comes in. This is the one cave facing north, and it was the only thing in the cave. You went to the end, and there was this object. And I suppose it's like a sort of chapel, isn't it? And the fact they found animal DNA in its mouth suggests they were feeding it, which is also disconcerting. How do we interpret something like that? I hate to say it, I've just used my imagination. I've just started to think a bit about how we do it. And using imagination in encountering a text is one of the things that I'm going to be doing a little bit this afternoon. Because philologists have often been taken to be people who don't like using their imagination. And I've always rather resisted that. I like imagining things and coming up with plausible explanations. And the nice thing about plausible explanations is you can come along and have better ones later on, which means that the job keeps on going, you see. And someone come along and say, oh, I think a better one, that's great, I love it. I'm always open to having someone coming along with a slightly more plausible explanation. And this leads me to the very first text, which I thought we'd look at today. Now, is this English? I'm not sure, because this is the Caister by Norwich astragalus, a bone, okay? And it dates from the 5th century. And there it is, there's the bone, and you can see on the bone little scratches. Can you sort of see them? They're above there. Well, I've what we call transliterated them up there. There they are, and they're what we call runes. They're what we call runes. Runes have had a bit of a tough life sometimes. People get very excited about runes. People go around talking about magic and runes, and there's a slightly worrying neo-Nazi element in the interest in runes, which we won't go pursue. And of course, other people get very excited by runes because, well, for a reason which I'm going to look at very shortly. But before we have a look at that exciting moment about runes, let's have a look at these. They can be turned into an English interpretation, or rather transliterated into Roman alphabet, and it seems to be that. Rahan, a roe deer, which is actually what that bone is. It's a bone of a roe deer. And people have for a long time wondered about why that should be put up in that particular way. Suddenly I've changed my voice. What has happened? I've been plugged in. That's it. There we go. Someone has turned me on. I'm bionic. There we go. I have got hearing aids. Maybe that's what's happening. It's all very exciting. But anyway, what's going on here with this particular object? Well, there are several things about it. First of all, look at the little ending on the an bit there. That tells me that this is what's called an oblique case. It's probably an object case. It's the object of something. That's interesting. What else about it? Well, there are other bones in the same cemetery. It's a cemetery, and there are other little tiny bones like that. And the general interpretation, which people have now said, is that this is part of a board game, a chase game, where you chase the roe deer, around the board. Okay, that's very imaginative. I can't prove it because I can't go back and interrogate it, and that's always been the problem with people in the past. Whereas Jennifer and her team can go off and go in the highways and byways and talk to people and get them to respond. When you're dealing with material from the past, there is the unfortunate problem of the fact that they're dead. And seances haven't really taken off as academically respectable. You won't get a grant for that, and therefore we can't pursue that particular approach. But that seems to be what it is. It's the other question is, is this English? Well, we're not sure really. Because when one language becomes another language, or when one language separates off from another language, it's almost like a wrong question. It's what we call an emergent phenomenon. It moves from one thing to another, but you can't put your finger on the exact point. And when you think about it, there's a lot of phenomena like that in the world. When does the water become ice? Oh, it's happened. Okay. When does green become yellow in the spectrum? It's happened. Okay, and this would seem to be one of those rather familiar things. And I'm going to come back to that notion of emergence once or twice during the course of this evening. Interesting, isn't it? Let's move quickly away from that piece of imagination. Let's look at something else. And here's someone who did use the imagination on this. This is the thing which gets me a lot of kudos with the school kids. This is Tolkien, okay? There he is. I was taught by a man who was taught by him. Okay, in fact, I was taught by two men who were taught by him. Look at that. And the thing you see on the left there is a fake. It's done by Tolkien himself. He did, in The Lord of the Rings, there's a manuscript which has been damaged with runes on it. And those are runes, Tolkien's own ones, because he took them. He was using his imagination. I have a sort of funny relationship with Tolkien. I don't know how many people here are Tolkien fans or not. Sometimes I was a fan and sometimes I'm not. The thing about Tolkien is that if you're a philologist like me, you notice that he's pinched it from everywhere. And you work your way slowly through the Lord of the Rings, and yes, there's another Old English syntactic structure. It's popped up again. Dear, oh dear! And I know exactly where he got that from. He got that from there was a lecture I used to give for years on a Middle English romance. And I found out a few years later that the same line pops up in the Lord of the Rings. He pinched it from there, and he lectured on it too. So there you go, continuity. So we'll quietly move away from him. Let's look at something which is other Goths' kind of imagination. And we're going to move now into Scotland. Or rather, we're going to move into we're going to become Scotland. Because at this period I'm talking about, it's not really there. Whereas Scotland isn't some sort of thing that sits there forever. It's debatable land, okay? And we're going to look at a kingdom which used to stretch from what is now southern Scotland all the way down into the Midlands of England. This is the ancient kingdom of Northumbria. And around the edge of the kingdom of Northumbria, the kings of Northumbria like to put up objects to say you're entering. Nowadays, when you enter one country from another, there are sort of guard posts and signs and flags and all sorts of things floating around. Well, you couldn't do that in the kingdom of Northumbria in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. What you could do is you could put objects around the edge of it to tell people that that's where you were entering, you see. And the kings of the Northumbrians liked to put big stone crosses up. And this one is probably the most famous of them all. This is the Ruthwell Cross, sometimes pronounced Rithel, which used to be on the beach down on the Solway Firth. So when you came up the river, came up the Solway Firth, you'd see this thing, and you'd say to yourself, I'm entering the land of the king who has great big crosses on the edge of his kingdom, you see. And it's what's called a hegemony symbol. And that's what you could see, you see. Originally, it would have been coloured. You can go and see it now. It's if you go down to that part of the world where you can just about see the little dot there, you can go down there and you can go to the house next door and borrow the key and let yourself in, and you'll see this thing sitting there inside. It was pulled down during the Reformation and then been reconstructed by Victorians who put it back inside the church now, and there it is. It's a Christian object. It shows Mary Magdalene washing Christ's feet. And there's quite an interesting iconographical thing that's going on that cross. But the thing that I'm going to concentrate on with the cross is the fact that it's got some writing on it. It's got a text, okay? And the text it has is in a variety known as Old Northumbrian. And Old Northumbrian is in one of the things that feeds into what we now think of as being Scots. I have colleagues who will say this is the earliest piece of Scottish literature. Since Scotland didn't actually exist at the time when it was put up, that's a bit of a big ask. But it's certainly there, and it hasn't moved very far, and presumably Scotland, as it were, formed itself around it. So let's take a generous view and think of it as being sort of Scottish. And the text on it is written in runes, and there they are. These are the runes on the Ruthwell Cross. And I've set them out in the traditional method of listing runes, known as the Futhorc. the alphabet of runes, and there they are. And some of them look rather strange, don't they? When I do a school talk, I often take a list of these down. I get everyone to write their name in runes. You see, that's kind of exciting, and rather a jolly thing to do. If you look at the runes on the Ruthwell Cross, there they are, and it's I've transliterated it into Old Northumbrian. And this is what we think it sounded like. Christois on rodi, huedreth al fusa, fiaran quomu athletil anum, istat al beheld. Okay? Which means Christ was on the cross, nevertheless their eager ones came from afar to the noble person on his own. I beheld everything. Okay? And it's a version of a poem which is found in other places. 300 years later, here's part of it. 300 years later, somebody wrote a much fuller version of this poem down. It's called The Dream of the Rood, a Victorian title. And it appears in a manuscript which is now in Vercelli, in northern Italy. And how did it get there? Well, it's almost certain that this book was carried there by a pilgrim on his or her way to Rome. And they left it behind. Don't know why. People have suggested maybe it was just forgotten. Maybe someone couldn't get it in the back of their pack animal. Maybe someone gave it as a gift. We don't know. But it's been there ever since. And that's rather a stirring sort of story. And there it is written out in so-called insular script. That's the opening of The Dream of the Rood. But to go back to our text, if we look at it again, you'll see that you can just about see the letters. Can you see them going down the side? Some people have taken the view, which I rather like, which is actually these were put in later. The structure of the pictures and the illustrations on the cross itself are different. And there's also a Latin text which is written out in a different sort of way. That, by the way, is something called an inhabited vine scroll. You can see the grapes. Can you see it? And the little animal is climbing up inside. That's why it's called an inhabited vine scroll. A little animal is living in it, you see. I think that's kind of cute. He's got a kind of jolly smile, hasn't he? It looks a bit like our daughter's dog. But there he goes. He's climbing up there. But the thing about the runes down the side is they're actually unbelievably difficult to read. For instance, we now think of words as having a nice structure, don't we? Word. Yeah. And when you become a good reader, what you do is you tend to read like that, in chunks, don't you? You look. That's called not going letter by letter by letter by letter. That's like me playing the piano. Dum, 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 dum. Yeah. I had a brilliant PhD student who was also a concert pianist, and I said to her, "How do you do it?" She said, "Well, it's easy." She said, "You just look at the thing and play it." There you go. And there was me going bong. The early days of typing, you know. Bong. So that was the sort of thing that is going on here. Very difficult to read. And it has been suggested that the whole purpose of this text here is not to aid legibility, but to impede it, to make it harder to read, so it becomes a puzzle. Okay? And that's actually an important part of what's going on, some of these texts. They're actually designed not to be easy to read, but for you to meditate upon. It's almost like a kind of prayer, okay? And that, again, is me using my imagination. People who've commented on this have said whatever it was that the person was trying to do, communicating information was very low down their priorities. It's not only, quite apart from anything else, it's 30 feet high, so it's a long way up. And I don't know about you, but well, you know, even though it probably was coloured, it's hard to work out what's going on. Something funny is happening here. And again, I'm using my imagination, my historical imagination, to try and work out how that text worked and how it functioned. I was talking about the pilgrim route. Let's take something else, which is another book. Now, this one is in Latin. So I'm not going to take too long over this one. It doesn't really count. But it is from what is now England, though at this time was Northumbria. And this is the Codex Amiatinus, which is the oldest complete Latin Bible, pandect, okay, which still exists. And it's now in the library of Lorenzo the Magnificent in Florence. There it is. Obviously, he's very proud of it. It's the first manuscript, number 1, okay, Amiatino 1. But it was originally made in Monk Wearmouth, there in northeast England. And we even know who prepared it. It was the abbot known as Ceolfrith. And Ceolfrith decided to give it to the Pope as a gift. And it went down to Italy, and then it was looted by some Medicean and ended up back in the Laurentian library in there. It's a fascinating book. It's huge. I've actually seen this thing. It's very, very large. And there are one or two odd features about it which are perhaps worth pondering briefly on, which I will come back to in a second. First of all, it's actually quite smelly. And Christopher de Hamel, a great authority on this manuscript, has said that he thinks it's goat. And it's quite a ponk, you see, that thing sends off. And of course, that makes us think of what Anglo-Saxon goats were like. And if you go to Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, there's a rather good kiddie place you can go to showing the Anglo-Saxon farm. So there's a creature sitting there. That's a photograph taken by me of it. And the question is it a goat or is it a sheep? The trouble with sheep and goats in Anglo-Saxon England is they're a bit alike, okay? And that means that when you go up before the great maker and he says, sheep or goat, down, up, it's a nice call. Think about it. There we go. And this is probably where it was made. This is now the Church of St. Paul's in Jarrow. This bit here is the bit is that bit of the left-hand side is later addition. This bit here is part of the old monastery. So it's almost certain that manuscript was made in part of this building. Okay, there's other bits of the building which have fallen down around the corner, but this may be around about there that you can go and do it. So it's quite again a very evocative sort of place. But the reason I've chosen to talk about this work, even though it's not in Scots or in English, is because it does tell us a little bit about what books look like and how you can start to engage with them when they're medieval or indeed older. That's from the Codex Amiatinus, and it's a representation of the chap writing. This is Ezra, Esdras, as he appears sometimes in the Bible, the author of Nehemiah and biblical books. And you can see him writing. Can you see that? And behind him, there's a book press, and the books are all laid out like that. Now, he's got a very substantial library. There's a lot of books there. Probably all of you in this room have a lot more books than that. But that's because he's part of a culture where you read the same book again and again and again and again. It's a bit like when you have small children and they like to have the same book read to them repeatedly. And the secret of success is always to choose a book that you can actually stand to reread. If we're going to have Whose Legs again, I really don't think I can face that. But there we go. There is books there. And that actually has all sorts of implications for how they read. You read slowly, you read meditatively, you read ruminatively. And ruminating reading is something that persists really quite a long time. Martin Luther in the 16th century was very keen on ruminating in the way in which you read. There's a text from the Codex Amiatinus floating around. Someone scribbled on it in the Middle Ages, but we'll draw a veil over that. And that's what it looks like. Real hard work. And to produce something like that, of course, you need a lot of infrastructure and a lot of kit, you see. First of all, you need to have a lot of sheep. The Codex Amiatinus would have, I won't say bankrupted the monastery, but it was a very substantial investment. There's a lot of parchment there that's needed provided, which has a lot of backbone of structure behind it. You see a lot of infrastructure behind that. And then you need kit to do it. There's a picture of a scribe doing his thing. There he is. He's looking at his quill. He's having a good look at it. Can you see? The myth that people kept feathers on the end of their thing that they tend to do this occasionally. They do that for showing off, but you quite often cut it off because otherwise it sticks in your eye, doesn't it? So that's not a good plan. And he's got his pen knife because he's continually correcting his pen. And if you look there, see the little hole, and he's got a thing sticking through it. That's his inkhorn. That contains the ink. And the ink's made out of things like oak apples, those little round things you can see on oak trees that you hoik out, and you stick a rusty nail or something in with them, and then you can crush them, and then eventually you get ink. You see, if you add a little gummy stuff to it. I did think of taking them down to one of the schools I go and teach the thing, but the teacher said no. And looking back on it, that was an insane thought. Some of you may, and I'm sure none of you here are old enough to remember, on desks at school. Oh, yes. Do you remember those round things? Yes, that's it. When I was at school, the secret of success was to sort of put pencil shavings into it, you know, and all sorts of rubbish. And there was a bloke I knew who used to use his glasses to set light to it. He was taken away and punished, but his name liveth forevermore. I don't know what's happened to him. Anyway, there we go, moving on. That's an inkhorn. Okay, that's an inkhorn. Isn't that interesting? But you see, Anglo-Saxon books tend to have lots of stuff that goes with them. And when you start digging into that, again, you're encountering texts in curious places. Here's one. This is the Alfred Jewel. It's now in Oxford, in the Ashmolean Library. But it was found in a field down in Somerset. And on it is some English. Now, this is definitely English, but it's a kind of archaic Old English. It said, Alfred commanded me to be made. Alfred mech hecht jewukan. Alfred commanded me to be made. And we think we know what this is. It's a sort of pointer, okay? And originally it would have had something like ivory or wood stuck in the bottom, in the mouth of that little dragon at the end. And around you can just about, can you see the writing carved into it? It's a very splendid object, actually. That's a reproduction of it, but it gives you an idea of its size. And if you look at the face in there, there's a little chap staring out at you, holding a couple of asphodels, and he's staring at you. Now, what's going on here? Again, imagination, painstaking philological and archaeological reconstruction has told us what it is. That's almost certainly a representation of the sense of sight. Okay? And we know this because there are other old Anglo-Saxon objects which contain it. That's the Fuller disc brooch. And in the middle of it, you can see a little chap holding a couple of plants and staring out at you. And if you look round the sides, there are other things. There's a man rubbing his hands together, touch. There's someone going like this, hearing. There's someone going like this, smell. And there's someone going like this, taste. Do you get the idea? So it's the five senses. And it's almost certain that that's to do with looking. So it's actually designed rather like the yad pointer in the Jewish faith, where you move the pointer across the text to work your way over the sacred page. And that seems to be what that is. And in fact, several others have now since been discovered. There's a few of them. That's the Minster Lovell jewel, which is found roughly the same time. And here's a couple of others. Okay? And they seem to have a term for this. They called it an astel. And we know this because King Alfred, the man who commanded that to be made, actually commanded these things to be accompanying all the books. It's bebeerde that nan mon van een astel from thar beach ni do, ni the book from thar minster. I commanded that no man might take the astel from the book, nor the book from the minster, from the church. Okay? Someone obviously did. And one of the things about these is they've been found in all sorts of places in loot. One of them was found in that one I think there in the middle was found in the Lofoten Islands. It was looted by the Vikings. They took it away. And so people basically seem to have pinched these things. And that's quite disgraceful, really. We're going to be coming back to pinching things in a short while. In fact, quite a lot of the objects that we now know about archaeologically seem to have this connection with what you do with a book. This is the famed Baconsthorpe artifact. The Baconsthorpe artifact, tweezers. And And people have for a long time wondered what these are. There are several of them come down to us. But my great friend John Hines was the man who interpreted the Baconsthorpe artifact. And it's for turning the page in a book. Okay? So you don't want to get your dirty fingers on the book, or especially if it's a sacred book. You use this to turn the page. And the hint comes from the language, which appears in runes written on it. Okay? If we look at it, that's its interpretation. Reda se the kunna, beothas runa aurat. That's John's interpretation of it. May he read it who is able to do so. Beo wrote these runes. Quite a lot of runic inscriptions are like that. They say things like, I wrote these runes on this stone, which is not a massively informative communication. But the thing that's interesting about this is there's actually a phrase, read who can, say who can, may you know who is able to do so, okay? Understand who is able to do so. Do you sort of see what's going on here? It's as though there's some sort of notion of adeptness, the ability to do something special, some special gift that you can interpret. So when you put it on the Baconsthorpe artifact, there you go. Work out what's going on. Turn the page. And that fits with the notion of riddling and puzzling and trying to interpret. Remember the Ruthwell Cross we looked at a second ago? Working out as a kind of puzzle to impede legibility. Again, I'm using my imagination, but I think that's a plausible explanation for what we see on the Ruthwell Cross. And this is what we seem to be seeing going on here. Isn't that interesting? And when we start looking at that, we can see, again, how people start to crack codes. Let's go back into ancient Northumbria, and we're going to look at another text which feeds into the thing which eventually ends up as Scots. And this is this. This is from the island of Lindisfarne, okay? I don't know how many of you have been to that rather evocative spot. It's one of my favourite spots, actually. I like going there when you can get cut off and you can spend a lot of time on the island, and then the seals come out and they sing. It's polyphony. It's a wonderful place. But that's where they wrote this. This is the opening of the Gospel of Matthew in the Lindisfarne Gospels. I don't even seen them. They occasionally travel about. They were in Newcastle not long ago, and people, they take them up there quite a lot because obviously that's where it's from. You see, people get very excited about it there, quite rightly. And this is the opening, as I say, of the Gospel of Matthew. And you can probably just about make out the opening words. Liber generationis Jesu Christi, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. Okay, the opening of the Gospel of Matthew. There are lots of things going on that page, and I'm going to underscore some of that already. But before I do that, can you see the sort of scribbles down the side? Just about see those. That was made 300 years after this book. This book was produced first at roughly the same time as the Ruthwell Cross, roughly the same time as the Codex Amiatinus. They're all part of the same culture complex of ancient Northumbria. 300 years later, someone decided to come along and vandalise it. Now, nowadays, when librarians get very cross when people go into libraries and write on books, they tell you off, you see. Actually, I personally find it quite interesting. I don't do it, of course, but I'm quite interested in what people have written on it. And this man was so proud of himself that he actually tells us his name. He was called Aldred. I said, I did this. I put these on here. And he had friends who also did it, who did it on other books, who copied him. So people obviously felt this was something very important to do. And what he's doing is he's writing Old Northumbrian next to it. He's providing a gloss to the Latin, okay? So it's interlinear gloss is what's going on there. And he does it even with some of the easy words. Incipit Evangelii, on Guinness Godspeller. He says, the gospel writer begins, the Godspeller, the person who's producing this. So there we go. What's going on that page? So many things. Part of what's going on the page is what's called the diminuendo. That means you start with one big letter and the letters get smaller and smaller. Can you see that? Big L, big I, B, E, R, and then it starts to shrink as you work your way down. This is a technique which is found in a number of books from what is known as the insular culture, which spreads across the Irish Sea and is focused about places like Iona. You'll find it in the Book of Kells. Recently there's been a discussion about where the Book of Kells was written. But if you go to Dublin and you go to Trinity College, you can see the Book of Kells. It has this too. It's got the diminuendo. And what's the purpose of the diminuendo? Well, here's another example of it. This is the Cairo page of the Gospel, a second page, another alternative beginning of the Gospel of St. Matthew. And you'll see the big chi and the big rho of the holy name. The idea is it's like prayer. You meditate upon the letter, and then you ruminate on the letter. And as you ruminate on it, you start your prayer practice. And indeed, some of the pages are so-called carpet pages like that. And that's like a prayer mat, okay, on the page. So it's a moment for you to reflect and pray and the sort of thing that you're doing. Isn't that interesting, you see? And of course, the closer you look at some of the writing, there's a bit of it. There's On Guinness Godspell, Incipit Evangelii, you see. Someone's written on it there. And that's Aldred, our friend, telling us and giving us information about old Northumbrian, the ancestor of what is now, I guess Scots. I love that. I love the Lindisfarne Gospels. It's one of my favourite books, and there's so much that's going on this object. There's so many things that are floating around. It drew upon huge amounts of art traditions. Most notably, if you look at some of the little animal heads there, the sort of floating around in it, look at that. There's Aldred has been there. He's written the word "Sothlicher," truly, down at the bottom, which I think is rather nice. It seems to go rather well with this, and you can see the strange little whorls and animal heads and so on, which the scribe has taken. The effort that's gone into this is huge. It's prayer, okay? It's a holy activity, and he's drawing upon a tradition of metalwork. This is the Sutton Hoo great gold buckle. You saw that film, The Dig. Then it's associated with that. So the animal ornament, there's little twisty-turnies things on it. It's a metalwork. Or the Sutton Hoo hanging bowl. That's got the little whorls that you could see already if you look very carefully at the cartouches on the bowl. And then we work our way back. There they are again. So you're actually seeing the metalwork tradition work its way through. Okay, that was the Lindisfarne Gospels. That was the Lindisfarne Gospels gloss. Let's look at some more glosses, shall we? And this time we're going to start to move into the area where we can actually start to talk about something we could sort of call Scots. Okay? And this is 200 years later than Aldred was active. And this is probably the earliest kind of thing we can think about. Okay? That's not a great reproduction. It's something called the Scone glosses. The reason I've chosen here to have it a Xerox of a picture from facsimile is because if you go and look at the original, it's worn out. Someone's been rubbing at it. And this was done in the Victorian period by a man called Cosmo Innes, who was an antiquarian in the middle of the 19th century. He was also a vice president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's one of ours. He was quite a wealthy man. He did very well as a lawyer and various things, and he was an antiquarian. It was a sort of thing that many people did in those days. But again, if you look quite carefully, you can see a little writing in between the lines. This is a Latin text, but someone has gone through and decided they're going to gloss it, that is, put an interpretation. And the thing about the interpretations is the kind of language they're in, because they are something that is rather like what we now think of as Scots, okay? And look at there. I've put them in bold, okay? Hes granted, hes litten, okay? Devises, was wont, hingand, dwelland, hingand, sunt appensar, hingand. And hingand is a translation of the Latin appensar. What he's referring to here is this sort of thing at the bottom here, a seal, something hanging down, which witnesses to the object. This is another of Cosmo Innes's reproductions. This is the a charter of names of staff of the garrison of Edinburgh Castle when Edward I of England held it in 1301. And there's a list of them, and that's Edward's own seal hanging underneath it. So there it is, rather a grim object in some ways. He wasn't there very long, but there it is, and worth having a look at. What we're seeing here, again, with all of these objects, and that particular is a way of thinking about how a text works. Is the Scone glosses Scots? Sort of. Remember, it's a kind of emergent phenomenon. It's when do Scots and English diverge? Not sure. Can you put your finger on it? Can't. Okay? It's an emergent phenomenon. And languages work like that. When does Dutch diverge from German? Not sure. Okay. When does English diverge from other languages in the Germanic field? Not sure. That's a wrong question. Okay? So because they're interesting, that's what makes it interesting. Okay, I talked about loot, and I'm conscious of time. Let's look at some more loot, shall we? And this is a disgraceful story from the British imperial past. And I'm going to take you now a little bit later on, another couple of hundred years. Not quite that, actually, about another 100 years, which is this. 1896, Africa, okay? Kumasi, capital of the Ashanti Empire, okay? The British decided that they fed up with the Ashanti and they thought they'd conquer it. So they marched in to the palace of King Prempeh. King Prempeh was taken away and imprisoned for a while, and then he was exiled to the Seychelles, and then he came back and became principal head scout of the Boy Scout movement in Ghana. So, you know, there you go. But while he was, this was a photograph taken by the expeditionary force. And if you see in the front there are these jugs. Can you see them there? They're out of brass. They're brass, big brass jugs. You know, the same sort of technique is used for the things, those controversial objects, the Benin bronzes. Okay, so they're bronze jugs. Okay, and there they are sitting there, quite big, aren't they? Big jug, great big jugs. Okay, and of course we should have given them back, shouldn't we? Because that's the right thing to do, isn't it? Well, give them back. Let's pause about that. I'm not going to give any kind of statement about giving back or taking. I'm just going to comment on this thing, which is why I've put it into this collection. Because it's one of those things where, like so many things in the humanities, unlike the sciences, whereas they solve problems, we take things and make them difficult. And this is the sort of thing that I'm going to do. There it is. It's now in the British Museum because the chap who got it back sold it to the British Museum, flogged it off and got some money and ran off with it, and there we go. And there are three of these things. One of them is in Luton, another one's in the Victoria and Albert, and they seem to be distributed around. But I'd like you to look at the big one particularly. And if you look at the big one, you can see little, can you just about see, I know it's difficult in this room, little markings. You can see little markings, and there's some writing on the bow of the jug, okay? Just if you can keep that in your head, that would be good. If I were really skilled at doing this sort of thing, I'd probably be able to show you all sorts of visual aids and move around with it, but I can't because I'm incompetent. But what you're looking at here is a whole series of little cartouches. And the thing about them is we actually know quite a lot about that, because the images on it are the same images which appear on this object. This is the Wilton diptych, and the Wilton diptych is now in the National Gallery in London, and it was the altarpiece for the travelling altar of King Richard II of England, the man who was deposed in 1399. And there are several things about it which are, the Wilton diptych is an astonishing object. If you ever get a chance to see it, you certainly should. That's the opening of it. It's like a book. You close it, and that's the back. That's the opening of the book, and then you open it, and there on the left is what you find inside. On the left is King Richard II kneeling in adoration, surrounded by three individuals who are all bigger than him. That's because they came from earlier and generally thought people have shrunk over the years. There's John the Baptist holding the Lamb of God. Bit of a debate about the size of the medieval sheep, but we'll move on. Edward the Confessor holding a ring, and King Edmund, king of the East Angles, holding an arrow, because he was shot full of arrows, as the chronicler says, "Swa ilis bursta," like the bristles on a hedgehog. and that was him. He was martyred by the horrible Danes. And there they all are, supporting Richard. They're the nearest he can get to special supporters out of the royal line. A bit tenuous, to be honest. And on the right, you can see the Virgin Mary holding up Christ, who's blessing Richard, and then around them all the angels. You may just about be able to see the angels all got a little badge on, you see. What that is a livery badge. And that little livery badge shows us a personal relationship to the person you're in charge of. And the livery badge is a little stag, a little white hart, which is the personal emblem of Richard II. So it's as though the angels are on your side. Okay, it's a special sign. It's meaningful. Now, they were considered to be a great disgrace, and very few of them survive. Here's one of them. It's not a stag. It's called enamel surrounding gold. So it's a very complex and very valuable technique. This is the Dunstable swan, but most of them were got rid of because they were considered to be an abuse, you see, and people got rid of them and melted them down, didn't like them. It's called en ronde brosse. On the ronde brosse, it's a special technique. So, that's on the jug. What's it doing there? Well, it's on the jug because this jug seems to have been made somewhere between 1390 and 1399 in the court of Richard II. Okay? Somehow it got from there to the kingdom of the Ashanti. No one knows how. It must have been done by 1399 because that was the year when Richard II was deposed and subsequently murdered. And it's got his own personal emblems on it. So somehow it went. Now, how did it get to the Ashanti? Well, the Ashanti kingdom didn't really get going till the 18th century because it was an imperial kingdom itself and it went around looting. Looting. Whose is it? I don't know. And I'll just throw that thought out there. But the thing I'm particularly interested in is the text which appears on it. If you see a little text there. Well, that text is one of those things which you can really dig into because it's Middle English. It's English from about the year 1390 to 1400. Some of Chaucer. Okay? And there it is. He that will not spare when he may, he shall not spend when he wold. Dame the best in every doot till the truth be treated out. Judge the best in every tricky situation until the truth be found out. It's a kind of, I hate to say this, it's a kind of everyday piece of rather boring wisdom. And it's put on this jug because this is a jug you use with things like wine and washing your hands as a laver, as part of the thing. And I guess the thing was a sort of talking point. You know, you had it on the table, you washed your hands, you see, or you drank wine out of it, and you had this little thing there which to make you meditate, you see, and think seriously and ruminate, you see. That's what you do. And the thing about it is it's a couple of phrases which pop up in other places. Dame the best is found in at least 3 manuscript sources, one from Norfolk, a couple from Norfolk there, and one in a songbook for the court of Henry VIII. So this little poem comes out of all of this culture, and somehow we're encountering a court culture object. So I don't know whose it is. It's now in the British Museum, but certainly it comes out of that kind of culture. And again, we're reconstructing imaginatively how this particular object worked. And objects get written on the walls. Writing on the wall, not good, is it? But writing on the wall happens a lot in the Middle Ages. People continually do this, and here's a bit of writing on the wall. It's stuck on the top there on that beam, and it's in a place called Long Melford. It's Middle English. It's a text which appears in lots of other places. It's called A Lamentation of Our Lady Maria. It's not very good poetry, but hey, I'm a medievalist. I never worry whether it's any good or not. You just please it's still there. It's a poem which was in the chapel changed for the purposes of the chapel. Okay, so the original manuscript version is all about how I'm thinking about my life, which is disgusting and vicious, full of nasty stuff, you see. And it's changed into the plural there. Our life remembering froward and vicious. Okay, you see the change? And that's because the text is being revised for the purposes of being in the chapel. It's a family chapel. And everybody is sitting there thinking about this, and they want to meditate on it. So they look up and see a text, and that seems to be what's going on. That's how that text functions. And what that reminds us about with the texts from the past is that a text change their form depending on their socio-cultural function. That is how texts work. That's what they're for. And I'll finish off with a couple more Scottish pieces. First of all, I want to give you an idea of this. So we're going to look at Mary Queen of Scots and her son, James VI. We're going to go on another 100 years or so. I could keep going like this for hours, but I'm conscious of the time. My daughter is a good one on this. When she was little, she'd say, "Dad," that's called turning you down, you see. So there you go. But hey, you're all here, captive audience. You came for this. There you go. And this is the Forman Armorial, which was made in the 16th century by the rather splendidly named Lion King of Arms. We still have a lion, don't we? He's up off Princes Street, and you can go and visit the court of the Lord Lion there. Apparently, you dress them as lion. I think that's rather cool, actually. Come this way, lion. And there he is. And it's an armorial. That means it's a sort of copybook giving you all the arms of the people in Scotland, the important people, you see. And there it is. And this is the one that was celebrating Mary Queen of Scots' marriage into the French Dauphin. There he is. They're looking very jolly there. Didn't end well. And to emphasise that, this is, I'm sorry to say, the very famous last letter that Mary Queen of Scots wrote before she was executed. She spent the evening sort of seeing to her affairs, and this is to her brother, the French king. I think the thought that maybe things would be okay, but obviously not. This is what she says. This is the translation. "Tonight after dinner, I've been advised of my sentence. I am to be executed like a criminal late in the morning. Thanks be to God, I scorn death and vow that I meet it innocent of any crime. The Catholic faith, certain of my God-given right to the English crown, the two issues of which I'm condemned, and yet I am not allowed to say that as the Catholic religion I die for fear of interference with theirs. As for my son, I commend him to you in so far as he deserves, for I cannot answer for him." Yeah, that's a little tough. They didn't get on. And James VI of Scotland and First of England made a special point of, he was a bit upset about it, but not very upset. Let's have a look at him, shall we? Because he's the one I really want to focus in on, because what he's doing here is very interesting linguistically. That's a letter from James VI. That's his handwriting. And like his mum, he's chosen to write it in what's called an italic script. An italic script is, again, a special way of indicating a special form of script. It says, look at me, I'm a humanist, I'm a posh person, I'm doing this italic because this is the kind of Renaissance thing to do, okay? And that's what he's doing. And there are several other features about it which tell me he's a Renaissance man. Notice these, can you see them? They're brackets. Okay, very exciting. Brackets were an invention in the course of the 16th century. The great Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, the great intellectual, he called them lunulae, little moons, you see, which is what they are. And using them was to say, look at me, I'm a Renaissance man. Okay, I use italics, I use brackets, okay? This is in 1594. But he's also talking in Scots. There he is. Because, my lord, your house has been so honest to my forebears, yourself has had the honour to be brocht up with thee. My since I married my aunt and gotten the keeping my twa greatest strengths, and whilk is most of all, which is most of all. There's a little brackets, you see, doing its action. This is him writing in Scots. James VI and First of England did both. He moved around. He never lost his Scots accent, by the way. Ben Jonson, the playwright, tells a joke about this. He has one of his plays coming along and say, I ken him weel, he's ane of my £10 nights. Apparently the going rate for a night was £10 in James's time. It's gone up since then. But James was very cross then. And he was so cross that he did the sort of thing that you can do when you're a monarch, which is had Ben Jonson branded on the cheek. That's a way to treat them. No messing. And he didn't do it again. So there we go. You're encountering Scots in action. Okay, well, I'm going to shut up talking now. As I say, I keep going like this for a long time. But what you've tried to encounter here is how all of these little codes that are floating around in these texts, all of them require historical imagination. You come along a text, you begin to wonder what's going on inside it. You say, that's a puzzle, okay? And what I've tried to do here is to give you a plausible explanation of what it is you've been looking at, a plausible account of what we're doing. And when you do historical work, which is the sort of thing I do, plausibility is probably as good as it gets. And that's great, because it means that people in historical interpretation can go back and think another way, and that'll be better. And that's what I always tell my students. You can do better than me, and I like to think that they will. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, for that wonderful talk. Do have a seat. That was absolutely brilliant. So we'll have questions now, and we normally have the obligatory 15 seconds of awkward silence before someone asks a question. But I suspect in the audience tonight that's not going to be the case. So we'll open it up to the floor, and we'll be fielding some questions from online as well. So there are mics. You'll be given a mic in karaoke style to ask your questions. So please, folks, fire away. Yes, brilliant. No, yes, here.
Thank you. This is a very simple question. The lion's head on the man's body, what was it made of?
Oh, it's mammoth tusk. It's a mammoth tusk. It's about a foot long. It's if you want to pursue it, there's actually a very, very fine discussion by someone who's approaching things like that.
This looks dangerous, Jeremy. This looks very dangerous.
Sort of tied up. It's Neil McGregor. He did a fantastic radio series which I've pinched shamelessly, called History of the World in 100 Objects. But he also did a series called Walking with the Gods. And if you look at the very first of them, that's this mammoth tusk, which he talks about in the Stardal Cave. He tells you a lot about this discussion. But it's a fascinating object. But what I loved about that series was the fact that he was engaging imaginatively with this material. It presumably was religious, but what their religion was like, we have no idea. And I think that's fascinating. Thank you. Pleasure. Deep silence. There you go.
Thank you. Apparently, the oldest Scots name is Calgacus. It comes from Tacitus. Is that correct? Do you have an opinion on that? And also, what is the oldest female name?
The simple answer to both of those questions is I don't know. In the old days, I'd have tried to bluff that one. But nowadays, I'm so shameless that I can say I don't know. Calgacus, yeah, I've come across that discussion about that's the oldest Scots name. The question is, of course, what is Scots? What are we talking about when we talk about something like some of those very early names? You know how place names in Scotland are fascinatingly ordered, and you get some of them say all the pit names. Have you noticed all the pit names? They're all down the east coast of the eastern half of Scotland, aren't they, mostly? And they're supposed to be Pictish, you see. Or names like Pennycook, you see. The pen bit is the same as you get in Penzance or Penrith or Pennygwilt or Penarth. And all of those go to another variety of the Celtic language. I don't know is the answer to that. I'm sure there are colleagues here who will be able to tell you that. We have colleagues who work on naming and name misuse, and I'm not an expert on onomastics. But there'll be people who will be able to tell you that. But I'm afraid I'm not that person. I'm interested, but as an amateur, yeah. Thank you. Good question.
If I understand you correctly, Scots is sort of derived from an Angle dialect, which was Northumbrian. And was there a bigger difference between the various forms of what we now call English than there was between Northumbrian and Scots at that time?
That's a very interesting question. Some people, when you do a model of what a language looks like, try and model them as a sort of family tree, okay? As though one stage in the language develops into another stage of the language. There's a certain truth in that, but in many ways it's better to think of a language which survives as being almost like a river, where things come into it. And a language develops more and more on other sides. What we now think of as being Scots, or the varieties of Scots which exist, which my colleague here is an expert on, is the result of all sorts of interactions and material which has come together. So there are elements here in what you call Scots which derive very like that we find in Scandinavian languages. And one of those elements is this thing we think of as Old Northumbrian. That's one of the elements which is fed into what we now think of as Scots. Old English, we have evidence for 4 or 5 kinds of Old English. There's West Saxon, which is probably the best attested, which is found in the south and southwest of England. There's Old Kentish, there's material for that. There is Mercian, and there's Old Northumbrian. But the actual evidence for that is in many ways kind of slightly problematic. Old Northumbrian, there are lists of names, there are glosses, there are, like with one we saw, there are inscriptions. The Ruthwell Cross is Old Northumbrian. But there isn't that much. And when you're dealing with that kind of material, you're often dealing with what we might call little hints, you see. And for Mercian, the language of the Midlands, what is now the Midlands of England, we know that it was probably the ancestor of what we now think of the Midlands of England. But the primary text for Old Mercian survives in glosses, which we know on a book which we know never left Canterbury. And the implication is that a Mercian arrived there, scribbled on it, and then went away again. It's worth thinking about that, because the nice thing about language is that it doesn't sort of sit there, it walks about with people, you see. Sometimes you get the impression when you read some of the histories of the language that language comes out of the soil, you see, and goes up your boots. You see. I lived in Glasgow for 42 years.
As you can tell from how he sounds.
I moved there in my early 20s, and it was too late for me. I'm actually from the West London urban sprawl. If you've landed on Heathrow Airport, you've landed over me. And when I met my wife, we had to get married because she was born 2 miles up the flight path. But what I'm trying to get at here is that language walks about with the people who use it. Okay, people often talk about a language like Scots as being the result of things like words like borrowing, and I've used that word myself. I don't like it because you never give it back. It's like saying, "Can I borrow a paper tissue?" Honk. No, you keep it. Okay. But it's a good question, actually. Good question, because it shows that the evidence we have is so slight. So we're always constantly trying to revise it. There's more from the Middle English period, the period between 1066 and the early Tudor period. We have a lot more material from there, and the evidence is they're much wider, and it's possible to talk about it in all sorts of ways. And I'm happy to talk about that at length. But great, thank you.
Do you think? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Well, you mentioned 1066. Do you think that's is that something of a dividing line, divergence between Scots and English?
I don't know. Is the answer to that. The English goes on being written during the period, but the 1066 thing is hard to say. 1100 or roundabouts, we can start to see a kind of divergence, but the divergence is as I tried to explain, a gradual one. Where is that moment that you can talk about it? Northern Middle English looks very like Scots, and it's part of a culture which seems to cross over the border, the present border. There were plenty of kings of Scots who sort of thought that Scotland should stop in Yorkshire. Well, it seems the obvious place. The current boundary is more or less where the fighting stopped. Okay, so the idea about there being a moment where you can say that's it, that's the dividing line, I think it's rather tricky. There are things that happen in 1066 which are interesting for what we call the external history of the language. So, for instance, when William the Conqueror turns up, he says, right, this place is old-fashioned. I'm going to tart it up and make it modern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get new castles, which are better than the ones they had, which I can prove, because I conquered them. And I'm going to introduce up-to-date ways of keeping records. I'm going to use Latin. You see, this is up to date, because using Latin wasn't going to change, you see. So if you wanted to record who owned something, and you wrote it in Latin, it wasn't going to change. It wasn't going to change until Doomsday. Thus, Doomsday Book, you see. And Doomsday Book wrote down in Latin what everyone was going to do, you see. And it wouldn't change, you see, because Latin was a dead language, and therefore it was good for records, because it could communicate over time and space. And what did people do with Doomsday Book? Well, they copied it. They illuminated it. They put gold leaf all over it. They walked around with it, exhibiting it. Okay? They held church services. People held it up. Okay? People didn't refer to it in lawsuits for 200 years. You simply asked the 12 oldest men in the village who owned something, as you always did. This is known as sort of dumb insolence, and a feature of sixth form boys ever since. And it is a kind of thing that I kind of feel it's a kind of positive thing, really. Fighting back. There we go. Interesting. But thank you. Good question.
Talking about the divergence between Scots and English, I'm wondering if there's any evidence or similar problems of even within Scots, like seeing how it develops into different local regional dialects, and at like what point do we start seeing evidence of that being written down as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. There is evidence for that. You can start to see it happening particularly in the 15th century. The trouble is, much before the 15th century, the evidence for Scots is so slight. There just aren't many records. And that's not because Scots were illiterate, though quite a lot were, because like a lot of people in the Middle Ages. It's because Scottish people tended to use Latin to record stuff, you see. So it's this kind of multilingual world, okay, in which different languages have different functions. So we're pretty certain that there are Scots varieties, because that's the nature of natural language, to have variation. But what that variation looked like is harder to detect. Also, of course, within Scotland, in the Middle Ages, a good chunk of Scotland doesn't speak Scots at all. It speaks Gaelic. Okay, so that covers it has its own issues about where people are. There is some work that's been done on this, and the most famous example of this is something called the Linguistic Atlas of Older Scots, done by my friend and colleague Keith Williamson. And you can go online and look at this, and this does give you a sense of the different kinds of stuff that is found in various places. But the evidence would seem to be that for much of the period in the Middle Ages, at any rate, the varieties of Scots are almost like suppressed. Is that because people are using the same kind of Scottish linguistic currency, and they're sharing it? Okay, and if you have something fundamental to communicate, you'll communicate it in Latin, or French occasionally, but Latin largely. So that's my answer to that. Looking back on it, of course, we can reconstruct varieties. Okay, and there's plenty of evidence from the varieties of Scots, which you can now use the present to actually explain and reconstruct what the past must have been like, and you can track that. Okay. And there's certainly evidence for that in the 16th and 17th centuries and so on. But before then, it's difficult. But thank you. Good question.
And if I can just add to that as
yeah,
well,
please do.
Jeremy,
Yes. Expert.
So for when you talk about the suppression, and there's quite a uniformity, and that's very much for writing. In speech, there's massive diversity going on. So the northeast sounding really radically different to Edinburgh, for example.
Absolutely.
So you tend to get a standardisation and a suppression of variation in writing, but what you were getting in speech across Scotland at that time, and still now, of course, is massive diversity with the different dialect areas.
That's what I meant by reconstructing it,
Yeah.
you see, because obviously we don't have any tape recordings, but we know it was there. We know it was there, and I think that's absolutely certain. It is intriguing, you know, when you start looking around at how written language has its own sort of history. You know, we often think of writing as though it sort of encodes speech. You know, and that's there is a relationship, but writing systems develop their own kind of way of doing. You know, when you write a letter on the ground, you press it, it doesn't make a noise. Okay, it's like a currency. You know, if you and I agree that we spell a word like through, X-U-R-G, as some people did in the Middle Ages, then that's how we spell it. If you and I agree that's how we spell it, that's fine. Okay, it's what we find acceptable. Even if people outside don't find that acceptable, well, we do. We're happy. We're all right. Okay, and if you want to communicate to someone else outside your area, well, you write in Latin. Solves the problem. There's another one coming up.
This is perhaps a silly question, but speaking about imagination, I wonder if you have a favorite theory of language in an object that your imagination has conjured before.
Oh, a favorite object. Well, it's one thing that I do rather like, which I was going to put in here, but I was a bit pressed for time, and that is something I did advertise, but shamefully didn't include, and it's a broadside. You can go and a broadside is a single printed sheet, okay, and it's the earliest form of something we would call as a newspaper, okay, and the one I'm rather interested in this because this is actually a reversion of something called the Register of the Privy Council of Scotland, and if you go to the National Records of Scotland, you can see this book. In the 16th century, people were starting to professionalise government, you know, and that meant signing off on things. So all the lads would sit there and sign off. And the register is actually mostly rather dull. It says things like the King's Majesty or the Queen's Majesty and the Lords of Secret Council. And then you get a background and then a problem. Mostly it's about tax, actually. And the bottom, everyone signs it, you see. And it's like recording a decision, you see. And everyone signs off on the decision. It's kind of early minutes. And as we all know, the person who writes the minutes controls the meeting. Okay. And it also means you don't have what's called creative memory. You know, when my old professor, he was a great one for that, because he'd remember what happened in 1948. And we weren't there to disprove him, even if we didn't believe him. So there you go. And that was how it was done. But that's how they do it. Now, when you turn the page, suddenly something funny happens. The Queen's Majesty is no longer there in 1566. It just says the Lords of Secret Council. And that's because she's just been abducted by the Earl of Bothwell.
Dear.
Okay? She's not there. The lads are on their own. And what you get is three fantastic statements. One is a condemnation of the Lord Bothwell. The other is a call to arms. And the third one is wanted, dead or alive. Okay? And it's all signed off by the lads. Now, the thing that's really fascinating to me is when you look at this object, the signatures of the Lords of Scotland. And they're all crowded down towards the bottom right-hand corner. They don't want to be the first one to sign. And that's because the Earl of Bothwell might come back. So they're being, you know, they want to watch this one. He didn't come back, actually. He was captured by the King of Denmark, who chained him to a pillar when he went insane. And his stuffed body could be seen until quite recently. A friend of mine saw it, and apparently the castle it's in is now a very posh wedding venue. But we'll just let that one ride. When they finished that, they decided that what they would do is something really new and novel. They took these documents and they turned them into broadsides. Okay? And when they were in the documents in the book, there's no punctuation, but there are big words, engrossings every so often. And the idea is you're a skilled reader, so you work your way around to the bottom right-hand corner, which is where the decision comes in one of these things. It's a bit like your payslip. You know, you zoom down on the important stuff, the bottom stuff you're actually getting down on the bottom right. You learn how to read it. But when they put it onto these broadsides, they're studded with punctuation marks. And the idea of these were they were going to be stuck on all the toll booths in Scotland. So when you went up St Giles, you see the toll booth. That was the place where you not only locked up people who were miscreants and ne'er-do-wells, but you also used it as a place for announcements. And they actually had a chap whose job it was to read them aloud. He was called an officier. And the officier had to go along and point at it and read it aloud, you see. And they wanted to make sure it was read properly, so they put punctuation marks in. You see? So it's actually the move from what you might call the world of the secret into the world of the public sphere, okay? So you're actually watching a text move around and changing its form as it changes its function. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting carried away there. I think there's another question. There's several. There you go.
I'm interested in what you said about, you know, the person who takes the minutes. You know, if you're the boss, then you take the minute.
Yeah.
And it's about the idea of oral culture and speech.
Yes.
And I'm interested in like the history of like poetic and sung texts.
Yeah.
And I'm also interested in the idea that a lot of the early texts you've talked about have been texts, if you have political or religious power, then you write and read the texts, and the mass of the populace don't have access to them.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering where in your text objects you begin to get clues that actually the evolution of English and Scots might not be at its most creative in the elite classes, but amongst the people who are being creative with it in everyday speech and through song and poetry and story. Where are the clues and the objects around all of that?
That's a very fascinating question. And again, when we're dealing with this material, we're only dealing with the stuff we can actually get at. Because, of course, the bulk of the population we can't encounter. Okay, that's something that happens later on, or where you get it reflected or refracted by people who talk about it. And that's a whole extra area of philological investigation. Talking about the notion of speech having primacy is something that has quite interested a lot of particularly historians, particularly who work on documents, because there are a lot of what are called charters that date from the period before the Norman conquest, and you do get them in Scotland as well. And a charter is actually a record of something that takes place elsewhere, which is the speech. And there are little tiny bits of this floating around even now in the way in which things like laws are made. And you find it in Westminster, don't find it in Holyrood, but you find it in Westminster. And the famous example is when a bill becomes law, becomes an act. And what happens with this, as some of you will no doubt know, is that a clerk reads out the name of the bill, and it's not the king or queen or whatever signing it, it's when he shouts out this phrase, "Le roi le veut," the king wishes it. That's the verbum regis, that's what makes it law. It's the word, okay? So the word itself, a bit like saying, "I declare you man and wife." It's the actual performative act which is spoken, and that still has legal primacy. Until that chap hasn't said "Le roi le veut," it's not law. Okay, so we've still got that little leftover. Of course, it's just a faff, you know, and it's a bit of a leftover, but it's there, and it's a kind of, you know, almost like kind of fossil. It's something that's left over from a time when that really did mean something, that it was doing that sort of thing. So there is that side of it, and you know, when we're dealing with song or when we're dealing with oral culture generally, again, we're having constantly to sort of rethink it. I've done this bit of work on 18th century material, and we know that Robert Burns, for instance, famously liked to collect ballads and the musical museum. But of course, the moment he's done that, he's changed it. He's moved it from one variety to something else, and he's a clever man, Robert Burns. You know, he gave the impression that he was some sort of, you know, rough chap, but no, he's having you on. And what he's doing there is taking this material and doing something else with it. But fascinating question, and you know, so much when we're dealing with the past, we just don't know.
Yes, thank you. Could you say a bit more about runes or Runic? Because as a written script, obviously it's not walked around. I mean, presumably it's carried around. But were there sort of regional dialects of Runic? Because well, okay, fine. Rather than there being a sort of an approved, standardised Runic alphabet.
Yeah. Yes, there are definitely usages across the Germanic world which are different. The example I chose up there, which was the one which was the roe deer one, is actually demonstrates it. We'll look at it later on if you like, but it's got an H with a single bar, okay, and that's something which we find in runes, very earliest runes in British source in Britain, but you also find it in Frisia, in what is now the Netherlands. And that's because Frisian and English runes seem to have a similar connection. You see, so there is a kind of there are certainly variations in that, and runic inscriptions, of course, continue to be made all over the place in Scandinavia. And if you've ever been to, you know, I was giving some lectures in Uppsala recently, and they're very proud of them in Uppsala. You know, you walk around everywhere and all these rune stones there, you see. And if you go to Arlanda Airport in Stockholm, there's a rune stone sitting in the concourse because they're so proud of the runes, you see. And people went on using them in Scandinavia for ages. There was the one found on Baffin Land in what is now Canada, and they say things like, "I wrote these runes on this stone on this day." Again, a classic rune inscription, and there it is. So people are still using them. They then have a rather unfortunate afterlife because they then get picked up by people. And I don't know whether you remember, there was that awful one of those riots in there was a Charlottesville one, which was a few years ago, and I watched it on the news, and I thought that's a bit depressing. And one of these clowns was walking past with a big flag on, and there was a rune on it. It was the Odal rune, which has been picked up by the neo-Nazis. It was used by the SS for a divisional slash, you know, and so it's a nasty sort of object. Not the rune's fault, poor bugger. You know, he didn't ask to have that happen to it, but that's what they did with it. Sorry. Yeah, but you're quite right.
Sorry, Jeremy, should we check? Are there any questions online?
There's no questions online.
No questions
just lots of
online,
facts.
okay, the room is ours. There's somebody.
You already mentioned that seances are a bit frowned upon as a research method. And I wondered if there was a time travel slot available tomorrow, which one question that's been bugging you forever would you try to seek an answer to?
Oh, yeah, there you go. That's like one of those questions I got from the school the other day, and I tried to bluff it and made a total bog of it, really. Let's have a think. I'd like to actually do one which is to do with sounds, okay? Because one of the difficulties, of course, with reconstructing sounds is that we don't have any tape recordings, or at least recordings, until the end of the 19th century. That's when we start getting recordings, and even they're sometimes somewhat fragmentary. What I'd like to do, if I was feeling really desperate, is I'd like to go back to around about the year 1400, and I'd like to have a way of walking quite fast across the island of Britain which of course is not easy then. Okay, well, maybe we've got a few horses. Okay, and I'd like to travel up and down. I'd like to find out whether it really was, people really did pronounce things differently in different parts of the country with regard to the vowels. Okay, because between 1400 and 1600, according to the classic textbooks, we have what's called a sound change. And a sound change is when you either develop a new sound or you merge up previous sounds, or whether sounds are redistributed in the lexicon. And there's a very famous redistribution of the sounds in the lexicon between 1400 and 1600. And this is known to linguists as the Great Vowel Shift. Okay? And we know that words came into English before 1400 because they're subjected to it. And words that come into English after 1600 aren't subjected to it. So let's take a word like doubt. Doubt. Now, doubt in my language has a diphthong, ow, ow, but it's borrowed from French, doute, doute. So somehow oo has become ow, okay? And that's one aspect of this thing called the Great Vowel Shift. Another word that comes into English before 1400 is the word guile, French guile. Guile has become guile. It's part of this thing called the Great Vowel Shift. Now, I know there's some people here thinking, what about Scots? And I'm going to come back to that in a second. And then words that come into English after 1600 aren't subjected to that. And a word like that is soup. Now, you might think, surely they had soup in Britain before 1600. Yes, they did, but they didn't call it that. They called it pottage. Okay? We don't say soup, do we? We say soup. And if you look the word soup up in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll see that the earliest references think of it as the sort of thing that my father despised, foreign food. Soups and ragouts, you see, the thing that the French have, you see. Probably foreign muck, you see. That's the sort of stuff, you see. And the word terrine, it's from French terrine, an earthenware dish. And though we spell it in a funny way, it's still pronounced the same way the French do. So soup terrine are words that come in later on, and they're not subjected to the Great Vowel Shift, but words that come in earlier are. I'd like to go along and find out how that happened. I'd like to find out the various people who did this sort of thing. I've actually written on this, and I've tried to explain why it happened, and I think I've got a very plausible explanation, which I think is the right one. But I'd quite like to sort of go back and find out whether I've really got it right. Also, I'd like to travel north, because if I travelled north over the River Humber and headed up into the lowlands of Scotland, I'd like to find out whether they really did it there and whether they did it earlier. Because there is, as those of you who are all getting excited now are aware, that the word doubt in Scots is still doot. A hae me doots, do you not? Okay? Just like a house, hoose, how, who, now, new, brune, brown, coo, cow, who knew brune coo? Okay? It's slightly unfortunate this is the word brune in Old English is where it comes from, used to mean shiny, so it really means how now shiny cow. It's related to words like burnish, you see. So that's what I'd like to do. I think that'd be jolly interesting. Alas, it's unlikely to be one of my achievements, but you never know. Thank you.
So I think the Great Vowel Shift is an excellent place to end. There can be no better end when we're talking about the history of English and Scots. So can we come together and thank Jeremy for a most wonderful talk?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And also, of course, thank you all for coming and being such an amazing audience, both here and online. I'm going to leave you now to go home and have some soup if you're feeling a bit hungry. And just to remind you, the RSE Investigates series goes on. There's one next Wednesday on seeing how our sounds are really made. And I will be back here next Friday, where we'll be talking to 3 authors and their use of Scots in their writing. So maybe see some of you there. Thanks so much, folks.